There were a lot of challenges going into this build. A lack of magnetism, a lack of lighting on the show floor of a convention center, and some surprises in between. Cooler Master allowed us to build in the brand new Cosmos C700P case, a modular chassis with an invertible or rotatable motherboard tray, live at PAX West. After being faced with some challenges along the way, we recruited Cooler Master's Wei to turn it into a collaborative team build. And honestly, it was one of the most fun builds I've done in a while, and the pressure of time meant that we were both taking turns dropping screws and reworking our aspects of the build to get it together the quickest and the cleanest. This was a real PC build. There were unplanned changes, parts that I wasn't familiar with, and sacrifices made along the way. Before getting to that, this coverage is brought to you by our Patreon backers at patreon.com/gamersnexus. If you'd like to help us directly with this type of reporting, you can get involved there. You can even join us on Discord to talk with the GN members and other members of the community. Alternatively, check out gamersnexus.squarespace.com to pick up a shirt. All said and done, the enclosure is exceptionally easy to work within. Every single panel can be removed with relative ease, so we were able to strip down the case to bare bones for the build. Our biggest time sink was asking to invert the motherboard tray to face the other side, since we thought that adds some flair to the build. This process isn't intrinsically difficult, it's not like it's challenging mentally, but it does require removal of a lot of screws. After all, the entire case can be flipped, and there are a lot of structural elements there. The motherboard tray detaches by removing 4 to 6 screws on the backside, followed by 6 screws in the rear of the case, followed by a few more screws around the shrouds. We got some help for this process, as the case is one of the first working samples of the C700P. There's not yet a manual for which screws have to be removed or in what order. Once the tray pulls out the back, adventurous users could pre-install the motherboard tray before reinserting it, though we did it the old-fashioned way and built in the case. After all, it's large enough that you're not going to be constrained for space. And here's the next bit. The entire drive shroud, the power supply shroud, the drive rails even, can flip to face the other side. This allows the case to nearly perfectly mirror its stock configuration or left side window, but the big downside here is that it does take time. Even with help, inverting the enclosure took about 45 minutes. It'll be faster in environments when you have some time to read the process and where you've got more light than a camera light, but ultimately the bottleneck will be finding and removing all of those screws. You're only building in a PC once, generally, so this downside can be at least somewhat reconciled by the fact that you're only going to have to do it one time. It's just worth noting that it's easy, but it's not fast. We ultimately left the power supply shroud out of the case. It would have made cable management a hell of a lot cleaner, but Cooler Master let us use their MIJ 1200 watt power supply, which, if you look it up on Amazon, is a $1,000 80 plus titanium power supply. Being that this is definitively the best power supply we've ever laid hands on, it seemed wrong to hide it, so the PSU shroud was left off. The power supply would be powering the Threadripper build that Cooler Master and AMD provided jointly. It's a 1950X build. There is a Zenith Asus motherboard in it that we've recently praised highly, and 2 RX 580s, which admittedly don't quite fit with that power supply, but it's an AMD and Threadripper styled build, and once completed, looked decent for a showroom floor. We would have liked to run 2 standalone PCIe connectors to the 580s just as a side note, but neither is going to be drawing enough power under stock configuration to cause problems on a single connector that's daisy-chained. For a show system, we cared more about the cable cleanliness than about what was technically the better option for routing the cables. We had to fight some tube length issues given the sheer size of the C700P. You'll want something with longer tubes normally, but the upshot is that we did get to try both the top and front mounting orientations. For the top, Cooler Master uses a removable cage for mounting fans and radiators, which we ultimately used for 3 140mm fans. This cage mounts by just 2 screws in the top of the case, and then it hinges outward for removal and is situated underneath the dust filter directly, which can also be pulled by hand to remove and clean. The fact that it's so easily accessible means that the cage actually serves its purpose of making the process faster and ultimately cleaner to execute. My teammate mounted the radiator front side while I handled the fans and video cards. Front side, the front panel and dust filtration panel are both removed by a light pull and grant immediate access to the radiator mounting cage in the front. As for video cards, those were oriented with the shroud upward, part of our decision to invert the layout. The downside is that the layout was an upside down CLC logo, but upward-facing GPUs gave us something different to look at, so it's a fair trade. We've worked with inverted cases in the Raven 02 from Silverstone and Corsair 600C in the past, and both of those cases have one thing critically in common. That is that they both received high acclaim on Gamers Nexus and in our reviews. As we got further into this build, we decided that it was worth inverting the tray after all. It looked interesting and unique and should perform interesting from a thermal perspective, but we'll get into that more when we have the case review. Ultimately, having fought with a Threadripper socket that didn't quite want to thread, tube length that was nearly too short but did ultimately make it, and cable length that was potentially a challenge for a show build where we were trying to manage things cleanly but quickly, we realized that we now had a mess of cables that we had to try and conceal. This was the nature of a time-pressured build where we were cutting corners and trying to get done in time for our Shadow of War meeting. Side note, sorry, we didn't make it. Fortunately, cable management was easy. We salvaged Velcro ties from the $1,000 power supply and tidied it all up. And then Wei came in and stuck the cable shroud on. The shroud meant that the backside was nearly spotless of cables, as you can see in our completed B-roll footage. And the power supply shroud definitely could have helped on the front of the case. And we did have 5 RGB fan headers going into the board, so that didn't really help either. But again, it's a pretty unique power supply and we wanted to show it off. Still, for such a quick build and for how large the case is, which means more direct and visible cable runs, the result really wasn't too bad. This case manages cables easily. The cable management bar in the rear is particularly useful and is where we bound the cable bundles before hiding them with the shroud. As for the challenges, well, most of them revolved around the environment. The case-specific challenges, though, included short cable runs with the rear panel RGB hub. They didn't quite reach where we wanted them when inverting the motherboard tray. We probably could have made it work eventually, given enough time and finagling, but we'd like to see Cooler Master add another inch to that cable run. We aren't sure if Cooler Master is planning to do this already, but it might also be wise to include a couple of 8-pin EPS 12-volt extenders, ideally 2, given Threadripper and X299, for normal orientations. The cable length will be longer for those normal orientations, unlike inverted. NZXT did this previously with their Phantom 820, which was one of the last major huge cases that we reviewed, and we've since been fans of the idea for full towers. The last major challenge was just the motherboard inversion process. It's a good chunk of time to get it right, and there's some effort that'll happen along the way, but the result is worth it. Just budget an extra 30 to 40 minutes to get it perfect. Tube length should be a consideration for closed-loop coolers. This isn't a fault of the case, inherently it's just the reality of a full tower. Be aware of tube length, check the specs before you order, and you should be fine. We'll try to measure optimal lengths once we have one in for review and can actually take the time to measure it all out. The case came together nicely, and being primarily full tower users at GN, looking forward to reviewing it properly. Thermals will be particularly interesting. The front intake is technically largely blocked off, but the case is also massive, and there's plenty of breathing room in the bottom. The sheer size of the case will also benefit thermals just by way of getting thermal mass farther away from components and having options to draft air in through the bottom of the case. So we'll check all that out in the full review, but for now, this was your first look of the case. We're more or less at review status already, just missing on the thermals and the noise element. Noise should be pretty low. It's large pieces of metal and glass, and those help eliminate issues with high frequency wavelengths. And the front even has some damping material in it. So we'll check all that out once we have it. As always, you can help us out directly at patreon.com/gamersnexus or subscribe for more, and we'll see you all next time.